So it finally happened. We think the wall has cracked. In a stunning late-night move that sent the White House into a total tailspin, the U.S. House of Representatives just voted to strike down Donald Trump's trade war with Canada.
And this wasn't just the Democrats pushing back. 6 Republicans just risked their entire political careers to join them. They were defying a direct threat from Trump himself to terminate what they are calling an illegal national emergency tax on every single one of us.
Trump is already on the warpath this morning, calling it a vicious betrayal and threatening to block the opening of that Gordie Howe Bridge in retaliation. Is this the end of the tariff war? Or is Canada about to face an even bigger strike? We have the names of the rebels and the secret reason that this vote is happening right now. Good morning, everyone. We're Dave and Deb, and let's get into it.
Okay, let's look at the numbers because they are shocking. The House voted 219 to 211 in a chamber where the GOP holds the majority. That is a massive blow to the administration. This resolution, the HJ Resolution 72, was designed for one thing, to terminate the national emergency Trump declared to slap those 25% tariffs on Canada.
And Deb, the word of the day in D.C., you know what it is? It's illegal. The resolution, led by Representative Greg Stanton and Gregory Meeks, aims to end the national emergency that Trump declared back in February 2025. Remember the one that he used the fentanyl crisis at the northern border, which was a complete lie, to bypass Congress and slap that 25% and later 35% tariff on almost everything coming from Canada? Well, the truth is, it's finally coming back to bite him in the ass.
They argued on the House floor that using a national emergency, which we all know is fake, to tax a friendly neighbor like Canada is a total abuse of power. This is where people get tripped up, though. Some viewers hear, "Way, the House voted to end this tariff," and they think, "Great, we're done, we're back to normal." Well, not yet, because this has to go to the Senate. And if it passes the Senate, it goes to Trump, and Trump is expected to veto it.
But don't let anyone sell you the symbolic line like this is just a shrug. Symbolic in Washington means we just put you on the record. It means we just told the courts and the markets and the voters that your story is falling apart. Because the real fight here is over the word emergency.
Yeah, Trump's emergency justification has been fentanyl. He said Canada is failing to stop fentanyl coming into the U.S., and he used that claim to slap tariffs on Canadian goods. But here's the problem for him. Lawmakers are now openly disputing that premise, and the public data has never matched the scale of his rhetoric in the first place.
Exactly, Deb. You know, they're calling it a loophole. Trump used the fentanyl crisis as a legal reason to tax Canadian lumber, steel, and car parts. But the House just officially said, wait a minute, there's no emergency at the Canadian border that justifies a 25% tax on a head of lettuce or a new truck. They basically called the president's bluff, finally.
And let's look at that bluff. We pulled the U.S. Customs and Border Protection data from the last year. And if you listen to the White House, you'd think, oh my God, fentanyl is pouring across the 49th parallel in semi-trucks nonstop. But the actual numbers tell a completely different story. And it's a scandalous one.
It certainly is. Get this. Last year, the quantity of fentanyl seized coming from Canada into the U.S. represented only 0.2% of the agency's total seizures. 0.2%. That's less than 1%, people. So to put that into perspective, for every 1,000 pounds of fentanyl that the U.S. seizes, only 2 pounds come from Canada. 2!
It's even more lopsided than that, though. In the most recent reports, the northern border accounted for only about 300 pounds of total fentanyl seizures, while the southern border saw over 26,000 pounds. We're talking a ratio of 90 to 1. And yet Trump is punishing Canada with the exact same national emergency status that he's using for the southern border.
It makes absolutely no sense. And this is why the word illegal is being thrown around the House floor. You cannot legally declare a national emergency based on a threat that represents 0.2% of the problem. That's like declaring a national fire emergency because someone left a toaster on in Vancouver. It's a manufactured crisis designed to give the president power that the Constitution says belongs to Congress.
And the House rebels know it. They pointed out that more fentanyl is actually being seized at domestic U.S. airports than at the entire Canadian border. So if the goal really was to stop fentanyl, you'd be taxing domestic airlines, not Canadian car parts. This proves the tariffs aren't about drugs, they are about forced economic takeover.
And that's the Trump tax scandal, right? By calling it a fentanyl emergency, he bypasses the trade deals that are supposed to protect us. He essentially is using a tiny amount of contraband as an excuse to hike the price of your groceries by 25%. Now, the House just stood up and said, wait, the math doesn't add up, and we're going to let you lie to the American people just to justify a trade war.
And on the House floor, you had Democrats framing this in plain English to understand. Tariffs are a tax that lands on consumers, a tax that hits families. And Gregory Meeks, one of the Democrats leading this, he put it right in front of Republicans. He said, Canada isn't a threat, Canada is an ally.
Exactly, and that line really matters for Canadians because it's not just partisan messaging. It's an elected U.S. official saying out loud what every trade-dependent state already knows. You don't torch your closest trading partner and call it security.
And while Trump tries to make this sound like toughness, the real story is cost. And let's talk about the Trump tax part because that's what moved votes. This isn't just about politics, it's about your wallet. The nonpartisan data brought to the floor during the debate shows that these tariffs are essentially a $1,700 annual tax on the average American and Canadian family. And that is the scandal here. The House is saying Trump is manufacturing a crisis just to dig deeper into people's bank accounts.
And that's why the GOP rebels moved at this time. They're hearing from their constituents who can't afford groceries anymore. They're hearing from businesses in Michigan, Washington, and New York that are literally closing because they can't get parts from across the border. This vote wasn't just about Canada. It was a survival move for all of those politicians as well.
And Pew polling just came out showing 60% of Americans disapprove of the administration's substantially increasing tariffs.
So when people are asking why now, well, here's why. Because prices, pressure, elections, and people are realizing that emergency has actually become a cheat code.
Now let's talk about the fallout because Trump does not take losing well. Just moments before the vote, he was on Truth Social warning that any Republican who voted to help Canada over the U.S. would seriously suffer the consequences during the next election.
It was a total loyalty test, and 6 Republicans failed it in Trump's eyes. We need to name those people now. You know why? Because they are about to become the biggest targets in the GOP. We're talking about Don Bacon, Brian Fitzpatrick, Jeff Hurd, Kevin Kiley, Dan Newhouse from Washington, and the real big one, Thomas Massie from Kentucky.
And look at the geography here, Dave. You've got Dan Newhouse in Washington and Don Bacon in Nebraska, states that rely heavily on agriculture exports to Canada. They aren't just rebelling for fun. They are watching their local farmers get crushed by Trump's trade war. And Brian Fitzpatrick, he represents a swing district in Pennsylvania where the cost of living is the #1 issue. He knows he can't go back to his voters and explain why their grocery bills just went up another 25% because of a so-called national emergency that doesn't exist.
True. And then you got Thomas Massie from Kentucky. Massie is a constitutional hawk. He's basically saying, I don't care who the president is. Article 1 of the Constitution says Congress, not the White House, controls the money. For him, this is a betrayal of the law itself. Only Congress has the power to tax. So he's framing this as a fight for the U.S. Constitution, which makes it very hard for Trump to attack him without looking like he's attacking the law and the Constitution itself.
But Trump is already calling to primary challengers for all 6 of them. He's calling them rhinos who care more about Ottawa than they do about Ohio. And they are traitors to the MAGA movement. But it really makes you wonder, what exactly is the MAGA movement at this point? And who are these people actually betraying?
That's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? Because if Make America Great Again was about the working class, wouldn't you want to stop a 25% tax on their groceries? If you're voting to lower costs for families in Nebraska or Washington, you aren't betraying the American people. You're actually doing your job.
Exactly, because it seems to me like the only person they're betraying is Trump himself. Oh, and let's be honest, the same elite crowd that we keep seeing pop up in the Epstein files, of course.
Very true. And notice who isn't being taxed. The billionaires moving money through offshore accounts? They're fine. The private jet crowd? Well, they aren't feeling the 25% hike on Canadian lumber. It's the guy trying to build a house or the family trying to buy a minivan that gets crushed. This vote was a rare moment where a few Republicans decided that they weren't going to be sycophants for the elite. And Trump, he is absolutely terrified that the rest of the party, they might follow their lead.
And the Democrats know exactly how to weaponize that dynamic because they're already telling you what the next phase looks like. Repeat votes. Now, this part is important. The House vote happened because the rules around the Emergency Tariff Authority created a pathway to force votes. That means Democrats can keep dragging tariff resolutions onto the floor and make Republicans choose. Defend the tariffs or break with Trump again.
And you're already hearing Democrats talking like it's the drumbeat strategy. Elizabeth Warren, she's been saying that the point of votes is that everyone goes on the record, and Republicans will have to live with those votes.
So even if Trump vetoes, Democrats still win something. They have a rolling highlight reel of Republicans either backing higher prices or defying Trump and getting threatened for it.
And that's why this matters to Canada as well, because we're not a spectator in this drama. We're a target in it. When Trump says Canada is among the worst to deal with and talks like we're cheating him personally, that rhetoric always comes paired with a threat, whether it be tariffs, border pressure, infrastructure threats, whatever he thinks will scare people into submission.
And that's another reason why Canadians should care about this House vote. Not because it's a win we can celebrate and move on, but because it signals that the U.S. system is starting to push back against using Canada as a punching bag. And that brings us to Trump's newest angle, the fear campaign.
Let's talk about the bridge threat, because this is where the sovereignty piece gets very real. Trump is threatening the Gordie Howe International Bridge. This is a project that Canada has spent over $6 billion on. It's almost finished, and it's vital for the Detroit-Windsor crossing.
Trump is saying that he will refuse to allow the bridge to open on the U.S. side unless Canada compensates the United States for the trade deficit. We talked about that whole fiasco in our previous video that you can find in the links below, where we share exactly what we think of that.
Yeah, this is a direct attack on Canadian sovereignty. And Canadians watching this should hear it for what it actually is. Extortion dressed up as negotiation. Canada paid for the bridge. Canada is managing a project. And now Trump is trying to treat it like a toll booth that he owns.
It also underlines why Republicans in the House are spooked. If a president is willing to threaten a major cross-border infrastructure to settle political scores, then you don't have stable commerce at all. You have hostage-taking. So where does this leave us? Well, the resolution now goes to the Senate. And while it's unlikely to pass with a veto-proof majority, the message is clear. The national emergency narrative is finally falling apart.
If the Senate does, by some miracle, actually pass it, well, then Trump's going to veto it. And Congress almost certainly does not have the 2/3 votes to override that. That's the immediate reality here.
But the political reality is the bigger story. This vote puts Republicans on the record. It highlights GOP fractures, it makes tariffs a liability instead of a loyalty badge, and it gives Democrats a clean campaign message. Listen, they raised your prices and we forced a vote.
And that's what Democrats are going to hammer over and over and over again.
Now, for Canada, here's what we should be doing while the Americans fight in public. Canada should treat this as proof of concept. American domestic politics, they can be influenced from pressure from not only the outside, but American voters who are connected to Canadian trade.
And that means that every Canadian industry that has U.S. partners should be activating those partners. With this many jobs depend on this trade lane.
And Canada needs to stay strong and keep diversifying markets and building relationships and keeping those boycotts going, which is exactly what we and our government is doing. So we'll see what happens next, but regardless, we are seeing the cracks in the MAGA movement.
And we have a question for everybody that really matters. For both countries, actually. Do the tariffs really help anyone? Or are these Republicans the first ones admitting out loud that tariffs are a tax, the emergency claim is flimsy, and the economic pain is landing on the wrong people?
Drop your answer in the comments and tell us something specific. Do you think the Senate will pass this again, or do you think Trump will scare them all back into line?
And if you want the names, the vote, the consumer cost numbers, and all the key quotes all in one place, well, we'll put it in our Substack today so that you can share it without digging through 1,000 headlines.
So make sure to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. And hey, join the A-Team if you want to support what we do and keep this community growing. And while you're at it, check out the links below for our merch store.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.